Welcome to Medmarc's webinar series. Today's presentation is titled Transition Out of COVID-19 Emergency, Demystifying the FDA Requirements to Keep Your Device on the Market. I'm Kate Klaus, Senior Attorney in Medmarc's Risk Management Department. On behalf of Medmarc and today's presenters, Drs. Christie Bergerson and Jianlin, thank you for joining us. Dr. Bergerson has a wide range of expertise, including in vitro diagnostics, artificial intelligence in healthcare, and orthopedic medical devices. She has experience preparing applications and performing gap analyses for FDA, WHO, and IVDR submissions, both on the hardware and on the software side. Dr. Bergerson has extensive experience with medical device quality systems and has led failure analysis efforts after a worldwide product launch. She has experience turning the voice of the customer into user requirements, then into product requirements down to detailed specifications, as well as performing gap analysis on product requirements and risk management documentation. Dr. Bergerson is well versed in testing to ASTM standards, as well as developing justifiable modifications to accomplish target testing. As part of her experience in the medical device industry, Dr. Bergerson has designed, developed, and implemented various sensing technologies and barcode readers using machine vision and computer learning algorithms for in vitro diagnostic and medical device applications, which were ultimately cleared by FDA, receiving a CE mark and were also received a CE mark and were marketed worldwide. Dr. Bergerson holds both a bachelor's and a doctorate in biomedical engineering from Texas A&M University, where she also developed the Biomechanical Experiential Learning Lab course and was faculty of record. Dr. Jianlin graduated from the top medical school in Beijing, China, and began her professional life as a physician. Her education and work experience in medicine provided her with a solid background and extensive knowledge to represent companies and individual practitioners in the life sciences and healthcare industries after she entered the legal profession. During her 17-year legal career, Dr. Song has defended manufacturers of a broad spectrum of life science products, from food supplements and dental adhesives to prescription drugs and medical devices, as well as clinical and diagnostic laboratories. Dr. Song's many successes include a number of reported no liability judgments for medical device manufacturers and life science providers, a dismissal of a dental board accusation after 10 sessions of administrative hearings, and multiple successful settlements in cases with multi-million-dollar demands. In addition to her litigation practice, Dr. Song regularly advises domestic and international companies on FDA regulations, CLIA regulations, and other regulations in the life sciences industries. She has been a frequent author and speaker on these issues. And with that, I am pleased to turn things over to Christie.
Thank you, Kate, and hello, everyone. So our presentation today is roughly divided into 3 parts. In the first part, we will provide some background information and FDA regulation about COVID-19 related products. Then we'll walk through the FDA transition plans for products on the market under both emergency use authorizations, as well as those under the enforcement policies. Finally, we'll walk through some case studies, and Jianlin will teach us about the legal environment surrounding these products in their current state. You can see the disclaimers we make on the slide being shown currently. It boils down to the regulations and the legal landscape around COVID-19 changes fairly rapidly, so exercise caution if using this information outside of this context. I will be starting off our presentation today, and Jianlin and I will hand it back and forth to make sure you get a complete picture of the information we're presenting. I'll be providing the regulatory background and the information regarding the transition for devices on market under an EUA. Jianlin will provide information about those products covered by the enforcement policies, as well as give us insight into the legal landscape. Right now, I'd like to begin by providing some background information on the FDA, so we're all speaking a common language. Then we'll go into the regulatory background of the pandemic in the United States to date. Exponent has experience with marketing COVID-19 products worldwide, but for the scope of this webinar, we decided to keep the focus more local. If global regulations are of interest to you, I'm happy to discuss them with you further after the webinar. So the FDA classifies all medical devices into one of 3 regulatory control categories, Class 1, Class 2, or Class 3. The classification of medical devices depends on the degree of regulation necessary to provide FDA with a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness and is based on risk. The classification determines the regulatory pathways and requirements that a medical device manufacturer must meet prior to distributing their device on the U.S. market. The 3 classes of medical devices in the United States are as follows. Class 1, Devices are subject to a set of general controls, which are applicable to all classes of devices. General controls include, for example, establishment of registration and device listing, prohibitions against adulteration or misbranding, keeping of records and reports, and current good manufacturing practices. These devices are typically authorized for marketing. Class 2, devices for which general controls by themselves are insufficient to provide reasonable assurances of safety and effectiveness of the device, and for which there is sufficient information to establish special controls to provide such assurance. Special controls can include performance standards, post-market surveillance, patient registries, clinical data, things of that sort. Many Class 2 devices require a pre-market submission, a 510(k) submission, or a pre-market notification, which demonstrates to the FDA that a subject device is substantially equivalent to another legally marketed device, also known as the predicate device by way of comparison. Class 2 devices are typically cleared or 510(k) cleared by FDA for marketing. In scenarios where a device has no appropriate predicate, a sponsor can proceed by way of the de novo pathway, where special controls are proposed and aligned with FDA based on the known risks and benefits of the device and the evidence to support the safety and effectiveness. In this instance, a de novo request is granted. Class 3 devices are the highest risk category of devices and require explicit pre-market approval. A PMA submission presents FDA with an independent demonstration that the device is reasonably safe and effective, including its manufacturing and the sponsor's quality management system. Class 3 devices have a heightened regulatory control throughout their total life cycle. For example, design and manufacturing changes can even require FDA approval. When your submission is said to be under review, FDA's experts on that type of product are reading through your submission package. This is not a short process, but generally submissions which are well organized and easy to read go through faster than those in which the FDA must hunt for information. As part of the review process, the FDA may come to the developer with questions. Prompt responses to those questions are generally another way to decrease the amount of time until FDA decision. In this webinar, we will be covering 2 guidance documents published by the FDA, which contain recommendations for transitioning from the era of COVID-19 public health emergency to the era where COVID-19 is no longer considered a public health emergency. One of the documents discusses products brought to market under EUAs. The other discusses products brought to market under the enforcement policies. When discussing these transition guidance, there are a few important terms to define. The public health emergency for COVID-19 was declared on January 31st, 2020 by HHS per Section 319 of the Public Health Service Act. The status of the public health emergency for COVID-19 was renewed as active periodically throughout the pandemic, with the most recent renewal occurring on February 11th, 2023. The Biden administration has declared its intent to let the public health emergency for COVID-19 expire on May 11th, 2023. EUAs are emergency use authorizations and are a path to market which allow medical devices to quickly meet a public health need. While they are related to the public health emergency, they are not governed by its active status. This means that an emergency use authorization for a product can remain in effect for the duration of the EUA declaration for that particular product, as long as the FDA has authorized it for sale on the US market. To say that differently, the end of the public health emergency does not prompt the end of the EUA coverage for medical devices on the market via that path. Enforcement policies are a group of guidances which Jianlin will teach us more about a little bit later in the webinar. They differ from EUAs in several ways, the most important of which is that for certain enforcement policies, the end of the public health emergency signals a change in their on-market status. Products on the market under these enforcement policies will have 180 days from the expiration of the public health emergency to rectify their position on the US market. In a webinar on April 18th, the FDA reported on some of the factors which were considered when developing the transition guidances. Given the magnitude of the pandemic, the FDA said it recognized that it would take some time for stakeholders to adjust for the policies adopted and operations implemented during the COVID-19 pandemic back to normal operations. The FDA said there were many unique considerations presented in the COVID-19 pandemic, including manufacturing of devices by non-traditional manufacturers and distribution and use of capital or reusable equipment. The FDA reports that it develop the transition guidances to provide stakeholders with recommendations and an appropriate transition period to ensure an orderly and transparent transition to normal operations. The FDA intends for the approach described in the COVID-19 transition guidances to help ensure that devices meet applicable requirements after the transition period and to help avoid disruptions in the device supply. Now, let's take a look at those transition guidance documents specifically. We will start with the EUA transition guidance. So, prior to publishing the final guidance documents on these transitions, the FDA released draft documents, which outlined the proposed transition plan and allowed for comments from the public. The draft guidances were issued on December 23rd, 2021, and the final documents were published on March 27th, 2023. The FDA received 22 comments on the draft transition plan for devices under an EUA specifically. Many of the comments received between the EUA and the enforcement policy transition plans were similar. Commenters requested clarification regarding publicly available labeling and devices which were considered already distributed. They also suggested that the FDA include reference to the use of real-world evidence in the developer's marketing submissions and gave feedback regarding the implementation of the unique device identifier system. Additionally, commenters across both draft guidances requested that stakeholders be made aware of the manufacturer's plans for the transition in the spirit of open communication and transparency. Comments specific to the EUA draft transition guidance suggested the removal of the recommendation for interim labeling and requested clarification for policies regarding in vitro diagnostics, including the application of CLIA, dual submissions, and laboratory developed tests. So many of these comments were reflected in the final transition guidance published by the FDA after review of the comments. Across both documents, the FDA provided clarity on many topics, including which devices were considered already distributed. The FDA also clarified the use of real-world data in marketing submissions, particularly that data which may have been obtained as the result of device use during the COVID-19 pandemic. In addition, the FDA updated the labeling requirements to clarify that labeling modifications made as a result of the transition may be provided as either a physical or an electronic copy, and that stakeholders may request a physical copy of updated labeling for reusable, life-sustaining, or life-supporting devices. The FDA also included recommendations for stakeholder collaboration regarding transition planning and included examples to help further clarify the policies. For the EUA guidance specifically, the FDA removed the interim labeling requirement and provided clarity for in vitro diagnostics, including CLIA application and laboratory developed tests. The transition milestones are generally aligned between the two guidance documents. First, the signal will come for the beginning of the transition period. For the enforcement policies, we know that will occur on May 11th with the end of the public health emergency. For EUAs, we know that the end of the public health emergency does not have the same effect. For devices on the market under EUAs, HHS intends to publish notice in the Federal Register, and that notice will signal the beginning of the transition period. This could be stratified by product type, with certain products transitioning before others. When this notice is published, or ideally before it's published, developers should prepare their traditional marketing submissions, meaning their 510K, their PMA, their de novo submission as applicable, if they intend to continue distributing their product after the end of the transition period. They should also continue to comply with the adverse event reporting requirements. 90 days after the beginning of the transition period, the FDA requests manufacturers or developers to submit a notification of intent for certain products with life-supporting or sustaining roles. This information will be used by the agency in resource planning for marketing submission review and providing support. Affected product codes are listed in the transition plan guidance document and include devices such as ventilator and ventilator accessories, anesthesia gas machines, and other respiratory devices. These notifications are sent to the CDRH Document Control Center as electronic copies, and the cover letters should reference any FDA-related submission numbers, including EUAs. At 180 days after the notification of transition, the FDA expects manufacturers to comply with the legal requirements applicable to their devices per the traditional submission pathway. This means that the FDA will expect developers wishing to remain on market to comply with the appropriate aspects of the relevant regulatory requirements and controls, including the full scope of the QMS regulations, adverse event reporting, registrations, listing, and the unique device identification program, many of which may have been waived under the EUA. At this point, the EUA declaration for the specific product is considered terminated. Marketing submissions, including the transition implementation plan, should have already been submitted and accepted by the FDA. In the event that a marketing submission was not accepted by the FDA by this time, or if the marketing submission was withdrawn, or if a negative decision was rendered by the FDA, distribution of that product would be expected to cease. One element of the marketing submission used to transition from an EUA to a traditional clearance or approval is the transition implementation plan. Developers are advised to submit a transition implementation plan, which outlines their intentions with currently on-market product in the event of a positive FDA decision and also in the event of a negative FDA decision. This plan would include details such as the estimated number of devices currently in U.S. distribution, including the process for updating the labeling on the on-market product in the event of a positive FDA review, and what will happen to those devices if the FDA decides to reject the 510K, the PMA, or the de novo submission. It should also include notification to stakeholders of the decision. If the product was cleared or approved for a non-COVID use via traditional submission, and it included a way to use the product for COVID via an EUA, the plan should also include the process and timeline for restorations to the cleared or approved configuration. The FDA is requesting this transition plan in part to avoid exacerbating product shortages and supply chain disruptions during the transition period occurring with the end of the EUA and the enforcement policy programs. Okay, let's work through a case study. This is a continuous ventilator currently on the market under an EUA. Let's say hypothetically that HHS publishes notice to terminate the EUA for continuous ventilators on July 1st. On that day, the developer would recognize the notice of termination and would continue to comply with the requirements in the EUA conditions for authorization. 90 days later, on our hypothetical August 1st, the manufacturer would submit a notification of intent because ventilators are life-sustaining or supporting devices. That letter of intent would tell the FDA if the manufacturer intends to continue or discontinue distribution via traditional marketing submission. If it intends to continue distribution, it will need to submit the marketing submission, including a transition implementation plan, and have it accepted by the FDA prior to the 180-day deadline. If it does not intend to continue distribution, it needs to include the plan for the already distributed devices. At this time, the manufacturers still are required to comply with the requirements of the EUA. 180 days after HHS's publication in the Federal Registrar, our hypothetical January 1st, the relevant EUA declaration is officially terminated. Manufacturers who intend to continue distribution keep distributing their product until they hear the final FDA determination on their marketing submission. At this point, they must now comply with all legal requirements applicable to the device. This includes registration, listing, the quality system, reports of corrections and removals, all under 21 CFR Parts 806, 807, and 820. In a scenario where the manufacturer receives a positive FDA decision on their marketing submission, the FDA and the manufacturer engage on the transition implementation plan to address the already distributed devices. For manufacturers who do not intend to distribute beyond the EUA termination date, they must cease distribution at this time. They may leave already distributed devices with stakeholders who have expressed interest in keeping them. However, those devices cannot be used. They may also provide updated labeling showing the change in regulatory status of the product, and it would no longer be authorized to be on the market under the EUA. In both cases, the manufacturer would continue reporting adverse events. All right. Thank you for exploring the regulatory landscape for devices on the market under an EUA. Now, I will hand it over to Jianlin to walk us through the enforcement policy transition guidance.
Thank you, Christie. Hello, everyone. In the next few slides, I hope to provide an explanation of the FDA's guidance documents on transitioning your medical devices out of the COVID-19 enforcement policies. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the FDA has issued probably more than 40 enforcement policies for medical equipment, diagnostic tests, and various types of vaccines. These enforcement policies served to relax the FDA's regulatory requirements and facilitate the pre-marketing authorization or compliance process and ultimately helping to ease supply chain disruptions and the increased demand during the global pandemic. Now that we are anticipating the pandemic to be officially over on May 11th, 2023, some of these enforcement policies will cease to be effective, and the products covered under these policies will need to be transitioned out of the COVID-19 pandemic. This applies regardless of whether you, as a manufacturer, intend to continue distributing your devices or not to continue distributing your devices after the transition. In both circumstances, you should make sure that your products are transitioned out of the pandemic regulatory framework following the FDA's requirements. In around March of last year, we gave a webinar explaining the FDA's draft guidance documents on how to transition your devices out of the EUA and out of the enforcement policies during the COVID-19 period. The final guidance is largely the same as the draft guidance with only a few key updates, but these updates are something that you must be aware of. The first update is that the start date of the transition, as well as the start and end date of each phase, is now definitive. We have a certain date of everything now, instead of, you no longer have to calculate a certain date before a certain event and determine whichever is earlier. You don't have to do any of that. Now, the transition for enforcement policy starts on May 11th, 2023, when we expect the HHS to issue that declaration terminating the global pandemic. And that is the start date of the phase 1 in our phase approach transition plan for with respect to enforcement policies. So phase 1 starts on May 11th, 2023, and ends 90 days after that on August 9, 2023. Phase 2 starts on August 9, 2023, and ends on November 7, 2023, which is 180 days after the start date, after the implementation date. And that marks the end of the transition period. All transitions needs to be done before November 7th, 2023. Phase 3 starts on November 7th, 2023. Going forward, that is the period when all of these enforcement policies affected by these this final guidance will cease to be effective. The next key update in the final guidance document is that the affected policies are slightly different. In the draft document, the FDA stated that 17 policies would be affected by the end of the pandemic. However, in the final guidance document, the list becomes 15 policies. 2 policies were added. They were not in the draft guidance, but they were added into the final guidance, which are enforcement policy for viral transport media during the COVID-19 PHE, and also enforcement policy for face shields, surgical masks, and respirators during the COVID-19 PHE, which may be relevant to some of our audience today. There were also 4 policies that were removed from the draft guidance. They were identified in the draft guidance, but did not make into the final guidance. These were quality standards of the Mammography Quality Standards Act, and also non-invasive remote monitoring devices used to support patient monitoring. And more importantly, face masks and barrier face coverings are now affected by the transition of the enforcement policies, which may be relevant to some of our audience today. And also the clinical electronic thermometers. all of the 15 enforcement policies that will be affected by this transition are identified in list 1 in the final guidance document. Most of them, it appears that most of them are class 2 medical devices, but there are a few class 1 medical devices. For example, here, enforcement policy for face shields, surgical masks, and respirators, and also enforcement policy for surgical gowns, other apparel, and gloves, and as well as for sterilizers, disinfectant devices, and air purifiers. Some of you may have products falling under these enforcement policies. So the transition plan, unlike the transition plan for EUAs, the transition plan for products falling under enforcement policies is a phase plan. It's divided into 3 phases. And as we already discussed, phase 1 starts on May 11th, 2023, going to August 9th, 2023. Phase 2 starts on August 9th, 2023, and phase 3 starts on November 7th, 2023. What are the specific requirements in each phase? In phase 1, starting from the implementation date, 90 days to 90 days thereafter, from May 11th to August 9, 2023, the manufacturers need to start complying with the regulatory requirements. Means the regulatory requirements that we had, the FDA had pre-pandemic. So what are the regulatory requirements that manufacturers should start complying with at the beginning of phase 1 are the adverse event reporting requirements under 21 CFR Part 803, the correct reporting of corrections and removals under 21 CFR Part 806, and the establishment, registration, and product listing under 21 CFR Part 807, Subpart B to D. These are the requirements that have been waived in a lot of the enforcement policies, especially in the enforcement policies with regard to class 1 medical devices. In phase 2, after phase 2 starts, manufacturers with products classified as class 2 medical devices, which before the pandemic would require 510K clearance or pre-marketing approval to get onto the United States market, will need to take some active actions. They will need to, if their products are classified as certain reusable, life-sustaining, life-supporting medical devices, they need to submit a notification of intent to the FDA to inform the FDA what is their intent with regard to their medical devices, whether they intend to have their medical devices continued on the market after the transition, or whether they intend to cease distributing their medical devices. They need to let the FDA know. And also, if they intend to continue marketing their devices after the transition, they also need to submit a marketing submission, an applicable marketing submission, depending on the classification of their devices. It could be either a 510K clearance application, a pre-marketing approval application, or a de novo 510K clearance application. And this marketing submission needs to include a transition implementation plan. And the requirement for the transition implementation plan with respect to medical devices falling under enforcement policies are the same as the one with respect to the emergency use authorization, as Christie already discussed. After phase 3 starts, remember phase 3, the beginning of phase 3 marks the end of the transition period. So after phase 3 starts, all of these 15 enforcement policies will cease to be effective. And to make sure that your products can remain in the market, you must have your marketing submission submitted and accepted by the FDA by the end of phase 2. So when phase 3 starts, you should already have a marketing submission submitted and accepted by the FDA. And if you have not received the FDA's final decision yet when phase 3 starts, your products can remain on the market. The FDA will not object to your continued distribution of your product. And of course, if you receive a negative decision from the FDA on your marketing submission, you should continue distributing your product right away. If you receive a positive FDA decision on your marketing submission, you can, by all means, continue distributing your product. But under either circumstances, whether you receive a negative decision or you receive a positive decision from the FDA, you should always have a plan on how to dispose or how to manage or transition your products that have already been in distribution, have already distributed before the transition starts or during the transition period. I neglected to discuss another key update in the final guidance document, which is we now have a clear definition of what it means to have a product already distributed. When a product is already distributed, when the FDA is talking about an already distributed product, the FDA means to say a finished labeled product that is already in the chain of distribution in the United States or already in the possession of the end users and have already left the facility of the manufacturers. So whether you intend to continue distributing your product or you do not intend to continue distributing your product after the end of the transition period, you should always have a plan on how to transition your already distributed product. And another important thing to pay attention to is that if you receive a negative decision from the FDA, whether or not you should initiate a product recall right away depends on the type of products you have, which we will discuss in detail in a couple of more slides. The product that you should submit a notification of intent are certain reusable, life-sustaining, life-supporting devices, which are identified in Table 1 in the final draft, the final guidance document. Beyond the transition, after phase 3 starts, what you need to do. If you intend to continue distributing your product, it is very important, and I cannot emphasize it any further, that you need to take active actions during phase 2. You need to have your market submission submitted and accepted by the FDA before the end of phase 2, before August 9th, I think, before August 9th of 2023. And then you have not received the FDA's final decision, which means, simply put, you have not received a negative decision from the FDA before phase 3, then you can continue distributing your product after phase 3 starts. Of course, if you have received a positive decision, then by all means, continue distributing. While your devices are under FDA's review, when phase 3 starts, the FDA intends to relax certain regulatory requirements, including the unique device identification requirements and some applicable labeling requirements. However, in other parts of the final guidance, the FDA does state that you need to provide updated labeling once you are going through the transition period. So my recommendation would be to err on the side of caution, err on the side of being prudent, and just comply with all of the FDA's recommendations. If the manufacturer receives FDA positive decision on the marketing submission after phase 2 starts, continue distributing your devices, but don't forget that you need to provide updated labeling to your distributors and to your end users to let them know that your devices are now transitioned out of the pandemic and received a new FDA grant of either 510(k) clearance or pre-marketing approval. If the manufacturer unfortunately receives a FDA negative decision, you need to cease distribution immediately. You need to work with the FDA to dispose the already distributed devices. And in that regard, the FDA may or may not require immediate product recall. For certain products, for example, single-use devices, non-life sustaining, non-life supporting, the FDA may not require the manufacturers to initiate a product recall right away after you receive a negative decision. The product can continue to be used by the end users as long as it is prior to the product's expiration date. If your product is a reusable, non-life sustaining, non-life supporting device, for example, if you have an X-ray diagnostic devices and modified, during the COVID-19 period, your product may be used if they are restored to FDA cleared, FDA approved version. Of course, if you restore your product back to the already FDA authorized version, then the product can continue to be used. Or your product may be used if you supply an updated physical or electronic copy of updated labeling, telling the users of the current regulatory status of your product and the fact that your product, the modified version of your product, lacks a updated FDA clearance, approval, or authorization. But if you have a reusable, life-sustaining, life-supporting product, for example, certain respirators, certain, life-supporting machines, your product can only be continued used only if they are restored back to the FDA cleared, FDA approved version, which was the version before the COVID-19 started. Otherwise, if they are not restored, you must provide updated labeling, either a physical copy or an electronic copy, and your product should not continue to be used. The final guidance also include about 3 or 4 examples, case studies. These are all class 2 medical devices. They may not apply to your medical devices if you have a class 1. And these examples are more or less similar, but I include all of them anyway, just to give you a better idea of what you need to do if you have a class 2 medical device. Example number 1 is a 510(k) cleared fetal Doppler modified under a enforcement policy. It was cleared before COVID, and after COVID started, it got modified, which happened a lot. If a portable device was modified into a remote devices, that happened very often during COVID. So when phase 1 starts after May 11, the manufacturers should start complying with all of these regular FDA regulations. After phase 2 starts, the manufacturer should make a marketing submission and make it as early as possible so the FDA have time to accept it before the end of before the end of phase 2. And that marketing submission needs to include a transition implementation plan if you intend to continue marketing your products after the transition. After phase 3 starts, if you've already made your marketing submission and it is accepted by the FDA before phase 2 starts, you can continue marketing, distributing your products. But provided that you should provide updated labeling to reflect the current regulatory status of your products. And after phase 3 starts, if you receive a positive decision from the FDA, continue distributing your products with updated labeling. If you receive a negative decision from the FDA, the best way to do is to restore your modified version of the products back to its original version that was previously cleared or authorized by the FDA. And also, important thing to keep in mind is at that point, you need to work with the FDA. You need to engage in discussion, communication with the FDA to properly transition your already distributed products out of the enforcement policy regulatory framework. The second example is very similar to the first one. It is a 510(k) cleared diagnostic X-ray system modified to become portable, and which the modification falls under a enforcement policy during COVID. So likewise, during phase 1, you need to start complying with all sorts of applicable regulatory requirements. And after phase 2 starts, you need to if you intend to continue distributing your products, you need to update your establishment registration as well as your product listing. And that applies to the last example as well. And also you need to make a marketing submission with a transition implementation plan and have the FDA accepted it before the start of phase 3. Once phase 3 starts, if you did everything correct and timely during phase 2, you can continue marketing your products till you receive a FDA final decision. And if you receive a negative FDA final decision, like as we discussed with example number 1, you need to update your device's labeling, you need to cease distribution, and you need to engage in discussion with the FDA on how to dispose of your already distributed products. Example number 3 is also a 510(k) cleared ventilator, a 510(k) cleared class 2 medical devices, but it is a ventilator in this example, modified to fit the needs during COVID. So likewise, in phase 2, you need to comply with the applicable regulatory requirements in phase 1. And after phase 2 starts, you need to update your registration listing. And for this one, since this is a reusable, life-sustaining, life-supporting device, it is a ventilator. So you need to submit a notification of intent. And you also need to submit a marketing submission with a transition implementation plan if you intend to continue distributing your device after the transition. And once phase 3 starts, you can continue distributing your device if you have your marketing submission already accepted by the FDA. And if you receive a positive decision, continue distributing your device, but with an updated labeling. If you receive a negative decision from the FDA, update your labeling, advise your distributors and end users that you no longer have an FDA authorization, and also cease, continue distribution, and engage in communication with FDA on how to dispose your already distributed devices. The last example is a brand new telethermographic system that has not had any FDA clearance or FDA approval before the COVID. So it is the same procedure you need to follow. Once phase 1 starts, you need to start complying with the FDA regulations and my recommendation would be if you intend to continue distributing your device after the transition, ignore the phases, start making your marketing submissions as soon as possible. So your submission can be accepted by the end of phase 2. So when phase 3 starts, you can continue distributing your devices. And if you receive a negative decision from the FDA, you will have enough time to cease distribution, to communicate with the FDA, and to communicate with your distributors and end users, and to update your labeling. Further assistance can be obtained from the FDA's final guidance documents, although we tried our best to explain everything to our audience, but I still recommend that you read the final guidance very carefully to make sure that you understand every little detail provided in that guidance document. And also FDA has webinars on the final guidance transition plans. I know one webinar was already held probably, I think it was on April 14th. The slides can be found from that website, but FDA will have a series of webinars to help their stakeholders transition their products out of the COVID-19 framework. And also the FDA's Q submission program is a very helpful program. Again, the FDA has been very, very responsive and made themselves available to all types of questions and requests. So if you have questions for the FDA, if you are unsure about anything, call the FDA, email the FDA, or submit your questions through this Q submission program, and you will get the answer and help that you require. Okay, the change of legal landscape. No doubt, this termination of the global pandemic will bring about significant and extensive changes to our legal framework. It is impossible for us to provide a comprehensive overview or a projection of all of the changes in the legal landscape in this short webinar. So I am only going to provide a few points which we believe may be relevant, would be relevant to our audience today. So you know which area you need to pay attention to. Of course, the most crucial change is going to be the PrEP Act, the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act. Whether the PrEP Act will be, ineffective, or whether it will continue to provide beyond the transition period, whether it will continue to provide protection and immunity. Rest assured that the end of the COVID-19 public health emergency on May 11th, 2023 alone will not automatically terminate the PrEP Act coverage for countermeasures. But what is less assured is how long will the PrEP Act stay in effect after the COVID public health emergency ends. To that, in that regard, the Secretary of the HHS will issue an amendment to the declaration under the PrEP Act. In that amendment, the HHS will provide information, hopefully, with regard to what medical countermeasures would continue to be protected and immune under PrEP Act, and what countermeasures will not receive immunity. There is a fact sheet published on FDA website indicating continued coverage immunity for certain vaccines and tests. However, that fact sheet does not mention other medical devices, especially class 1 medical devices. So there is still a lot unknown, and manufacturers should closely monitor the release of the HHS PrEP Act. So should their counsel, such as us. We should keep a very close eyes on the HHS PrEP Act amendment. Of course, changes, there will be significant, extensive changes to the supply chain and the demand. The supply chain disruption hopefully will stabilize, and the demand may return to normal levels. There will be legal implications related to contract and labor disputes, as you can imagine. So manufacturers should reevaluate and adjust their supply chain strategies to be adapted to the changing market, and should continue monitoring any regulatory requirements, new regulatory requirements in this changed local and international market. Another significant change that we can foresee right now is changes to telehealth and remote monitoring devices, which almost entirely arose after COVID-19 started. So as the world is becoming more adaptable to telehealth and to remote monitoring practice, there will be stricter regulations governing this type of practice after the COVID pandemic ends. And there will be changes to insurance coverage and to reimbursement policies. Manufacturers should, again, closely monitor the changing regulation and adjust their product and service accordingly. And collaboration with healthcare providers and the payers is essential to navigate and adapt to any changes in this area, telehealth and remote monitoring area, and pay attention to any changes to the relevant policies. And with that, we conclude today's webinar, and we welcome questions from our audience.
Let me take you through, so thank you, Jianlin. Let me take you through some of the questions that were asked by the FDA during a webinar that they hosted on April 18th. So industry members asked some very important questions and received answers directly from the FDA. And I'm sure many of the members of our audience have questions over the content that we provided today. So in addition to hopefully having time to maybe answer some questions at the end, or definitely answering them if you email them to us, I want to make sure we went over these as well. As a precursor, I will note that the FDA is heavily encouraging traditional marketing submissions as soon as possible, as you've heard multiple times in this webinar. So during the transition period, the FDA will still be reviewing and rendering decisions on amendments submitted to EUAs. For single-use, non-life-sustaining or supporting devices such as masks, which do not have a traditional submission accepted by the end of the transition period, use up the current stock that you have. The product will remain eligible for use until its expiration date. Note that the information contained herein is for medical devices regulated by CDRH and not for drugs or vaccines related to COVID-19. CDER, or CDER, will have different policies in place for those products. There are enforcement policies not listed on list 1, which do not expire with the public health emergency on May 11th. For many of those, the FDA did not include them on list 1 because they're planning to release a successive policy. This publication should be released prior to the end date, which may be listed on the top of that guidance. And finally, there are product-specific questions which will not be addressed by the guidances. For those, just as Jianlin said, please remember about the availability of the Q-Sub process. In this process, you can submit a specific question to the FDA and the FDA will respond. An example of the type of question would be whether a manufacturer who does not intend to continue distribution can replace or repair ventilators which malfunction. This would be a great candidate for a Q-Sub because the FDA's response will differ depending on the type of repair or modification necessary. So I hope you found this webinar helpful. To give a high-level summary of the regulatory information we provided, note that the public health emergency is indeed ending on May 11th, but that means different things for different products. List 1 enforcement policy products will begin to transition on May 11th, but EUA products will not begin their transition until HHS publishes notice in the Federal Registrar. While this seems to be yet another time of regulatory turmoil, one thing remains certain. The FDA recommends you submit your traditional marketing submissions earlier rather than later. Don't wait to react, submit them proactively. So for anyone in the audience with an in vitro diagnostic specific question, you are in luck. There's another webinar hosted by the FDA specifically focusing on in vitro diagnostics tomorrow. It's from 12:05 to 1 p.m. Eastern. I'll be there, and I hope to see you in the participants list as well. So we hope you enjoyed our webinar, and in our last 3 minutes, we would love to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you both so much. This has been really helpful. It's great information for our audience. We do have one question that I thought was great that that would be really helpful. It is, can a company use its own product on the market under an EUA as the predicate device for a 510(k) submission?
Oh my goodness, that's a good question. And it's tempting, right? Because you know everything about that product already. So unfortunately, the short answer is no, you can't. For a 510(k), your predicate must be a legally cleared on the market device that's usually been cleared under a 510(k).
Thank you. And one additional question, could you talk a little bit about how whatever your specific product code is for your device could change your obligations?
So the obligations for a specific device will be product code specific, just as you mentioned, and the product code notifications, declarations of authorizations for the emergency use authorizations will come through the federal registrar, and the modifications for each specific product code will be communicated by the FDA in that way. To summarize what I'm saying and take it out of FDA speak, wait for the HHS to make the public declaration that this specific type of product is now transitioning. When they do that, you will get notice from the FDA that says, okay, we know that previously you had to do this, this, that, and the other. Now your regulatory requirements will look like this. You have 180 days, go.
Yep. And you can sign up for an email blast that comes out every morning with all of the new things that are in the Federal Register for that day. So once that becomes relevant, you may want to sign up just so you're on top of when your product code is announced.
Excellent idea.
Christie and Jianlin, thank you very much for your time today. These are big changes ahead as we transition out of the pandemic protocols. And I know that this information is really useful for our audience.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us. Thanks, everyone.